Hey, okay, so this will be just a few words about the final exam. Basically, it's the one thing that we have left. This will be next week, so it's the regular exam week. I'm hoping you can do that on either the Monday or the Tuesday or the Wednesday. You're going to need 2 hours. Well, that should be quite generous, but just plan ahead and think accordingly where you can be in a good place, hopefully reliable internet connection during that period. If for some reason that is not doable for you, just let me know as soon as you can. There's 14 questions, I think I said, so 10 of those, that's just basically a built-in quiz. It's basically a quiz, just like the other quizzes, for the material from the final week, basically. So just go over that. You should be fine with that. Then there'll be basically 3 written questions, and then I just added in a 4th written question. It's basically a bonus question, about which I'm not really going to say anything, but just think about what you've thought about, what you've learned, what was interesting from the course. You should be okay. You don't have to do it anyway, it doesn't matter. So anyway, the other 3 questions, that's the main thing, and what I've said for you to do, the way to prepare for this, I thought this would be a more, sort of a helpful and a good way to do it. I'm just going to give you that list of 7 articles. It's basically one from each week. Just focus on those, and the questions will have to do with those, either specifically just that, or usually it would certainly involve that, but it may also involve making some connections between them. So try to have that in mind. Usually if you've got a good handle on an article, on the reasoning, the arguments, and so on itself, then you should be pretty good, in a pretty good position to make some connections or comparisons or whatever if you need to do that. I'm just going to say fairly quick, brief few words about each of these 7 articles. We've already talked about all of them, but anyways, I just thought I'd go back over and remind you of a few things. So the first was from Rachel's, basically. Remember that? That's from the Euthanasia Week. Not very long, pretty clear article, I think, basically, right? He's basically arguing, quite clearly against the distinction between killing and letting die, and showing, well, this has pretty significant implication, showing, well, there's not really any direct moral significance in the contrast between so-called active and passive euthanasia. He has that thought experiment. Remember, I think he calls it the Smith-Jones one. Philosophers often use those names for some reason. Anyway, the Smith-Jones, it's a little made up, it's fanciful, but it's supposed to be a kind of a thought experiment that shows something and is supposed to help carry that argument or do some of the work. So think about that, basically, how convincing it might be and what implications all of this could have. There was the piece from Robertson, you'll recall, I'm sure, about procreative liberty. He makes a pretty strong case for the so-called primacy of procreative liberty, right, as a negative right. Keep that in mind, based on a kind of procreative interest, and keep in mind this has to do with genetic relatedness, right? Having a child that's genetically related, he thinks that's very important for somebody, and that's really crucial to the reasoning. It doesn't get so far if you take that away. And remember, especially too, this is not unlimited necessarily, right? He's just basically setting the bar fairly high, thinking that you have to show something like a very significant, tangible harm in order to somehow override this right. So it can be done. He just thinks, in lots of cases that people might be opposed to, they might not really be able to meet that standard for their objection. And keep in mind, too, Robertson is, like lots of people talking about negative rights, they don't mean to in any way endorse them. They just think they're pointing out there is, morally speaking, a certain right for people to be able to do this or that. In this case, to make use of what resources or technologies, etc., are available to that end. And he is not necessarily speaking for and against whether anyone should or not, but just that they should not be interfered with. There's the piece from Brock on reproductive cloning. Remember that he kind of gives reasoning and reasons for and against. It's kind of a balanced view in the end. He's not really big on cloning, right? He's not really thinking, as some individuals out there might. He's not really thinking it's incredibly important. So he's a lot cooler when it comes to the kind of procreative interest that Robertson had in mind. He doesn't really think it's that big a deal, basically. The idea, many people share this view, genetic relatedness perhaps is really overrated, I should say, overrated. It's not such a deep and crucial human interest, basically. Nonetheless, whatever, people might want it, and he's just not pushing so hard on it, and on the other hand, he doesn't think it's so bad for the children that may result from this. Remember, he's making arguments. A lot of the objections have a lot to do with genetic determinism, which is just not true. So some of the issues about, having an open future and so on don't quite cut it as far as making an objection to the permissibility of genetic cloning. Something to think about, though, could be, Brock doesn't exactly go here, but something interesting to think about, just what some of these reasons he gives for and against, what it might mean with regard to genetic enhancement, right? So his focus here kind of on reproductive cloning, having a genetic relation to a child is basically just focused on that, but whether or not some of these things would have further implications is something you could think about. Then there's a reading from Purdy, remember, basically. She's basically making an argument which could appear to be very different from, say, Robertson. Placing very clear limit on at least certain people's procreative liberty, basically, where the resulting child might have some very serious genetic condition, basically. So she's coming at that from the perspective of having, there being a duty to ensure that children, say, have some kind of minimally satisfying life. There's kind of a minimum threshold that should be met. And she gives, of course, the example of Huntington's disease, and she thinks that's an example of something that would fail to meet that condition. Now, she's like Brock in a little way, too. There's a common point there. She, too, like Brock, doesn't sort of share the view that genetic relatedness is so crucial. And so she thinks that if, the only way certain people could have a genetic relation to their child was to pass along a certain genetic condition, which would potentially fail to meet the standard of a minimally satisfying life. She says, yeah, so what? It's just too bad, right? We have that duty first to ensure that minimum standard is achieved, right? And genetic relatedness is not so important as to override that. So think about what she means by a minimally satisfying life. It's very important what she means by that, how she tries to at least roughly kind of establish that threshold. Whether this is consistent with Robertson, as I say, sort of on the surface, it appears as if they're going in different directions. But remember, Robertson did not put forward an unlimited conception of procreative liberty. So the idea of what he was talking about in terms of a tangible, substantial harm, well, it might actually line up with what Purdy's talking about here in terms of falling short of a minimally satisfying life. And you can think just what this might mean in terms of enhancement, basically, whether this somehow provides ammunition, say, for people who think, say, that genetic enhancement ought to be permissible because it might be the only way for people who want genetically related children to get them if they're in this situation where those children are going to inherit some kind of negative genetic condition. Turning to Harris, remember the article from Harris, he's talking about enhancement, in particular trying to break down the distinction between, say, treatment and enhancement, or as I think he put it, curing dysfunction and enhancing function. And he makes some decent arguments there, but in particular in terms of germline therapy, that's maybe where it's most significant, basically. So there is a connection there with Purdy, right? He too would certainly say that people should not, say, reproduce or procreate, bring about children who might inherit some negative genetic condition, something like that. But he's kind of adding to it, this idea that at least if the possibility is there medically or technologically to be able to do something, then one, of course, really should. Now, this would apply also to conditions that aren't so serious or severe. And anyway, there's where the connection, you can think whether Purdy would agree with that or kind of go in that direction. Another thing I had flagged earlier when we were talking about this is just there is this underlying kind of assumption, really, that if a certain kind of medical technology is available, and if this technology could, say, improve somebody or a future person's life, then it must be used. There is a certain kind of imperative to enhance, and just whether or not that makes sense. You may have thought about this in writing your second essay or currently, whether there isn't an imperative along those lines, or whether that, it's just, if it's possible, perhaps it may be permissible, but that's very different from them being an imperative to make use of any such technology. Then we got Daniels. So this is a little more recent, might be a little more fresh in your memory, talking about Daniels, talking about justice. So he basically takes that Rawlsian approach, and that means, well, there's those two principles, right? First, and the most important, the one that is prioritized, focusing on equality, and equality as much as possible that is consistent with the same for all. So that's like this idea of a basic tier of healthcare, really as a positive right. Beyond which then, this is kind of the Rawlsian view, it's possible, it's permissible, right? It's okay to have inequalities so long as those equalities aren't taking away or in any way undermining or detracting from that more fundamental equality. So that if somehow they are basically helping everybody, basically. That's kind of the idea. The idea is that, okay, we could permit certain kinds of inequalities so long as, in effect, everybody is benefiting from them. Now, what's going to go into that basic tier in terms of, more concretely understood what medical services would actually be included within it, he notes, of course, this can vary between different societies and different times and so on, depending on what's available in terms of resources, just what's technologically possible and so on. I mean, the most important thing just might be, yes, the overall level of resources. Healthcare is just one thing among other public goods. There has to be decisions of so-called macro allocation, depending on what's going to go in. So it can always be sort of contextual in that sense, basically. But the idea is that, this seems to capture best what we really mean by a fair system, basically. So the sense of justice and fairness going hand in hand here. And the question you could think about in terms, hang on a second. Sorry, I just mixed up my notes here. You want to be thinking about, we have this basic tier of equality. That's all well and good, but, the idea is present there, and we're thinking that, of course, what it actually looks like has to do with the actual available resources, and what does happen then in situations of greater and greater scarcity of resources, basically. Just sometimes it's possible, that kind of resource scarcity could really, mess up what we mean by equality or a more egalitarian distribution. Anyway, that's going to kind of get into the last thing with the recommendations from the Emmanuel and others article. But just think about that, in terms of, what really drives, or where does that notion of equality come from? We're kind of seeing it at a certain level in Daniels, but if we dig deeper into situations where scarcity is just more conspicuous, basically, what do we mean by equality there? Right? So it's easy to think when you've got a basic tier and it's kind of up and running and that's all well and good. When there are deeper problems or greater scarcity, just what are sort of the deeper considerations bearing upon equality that can guide us? So just quick then, so the last thing, Emmanuel, I just wanted to focus mainly on sort of the main recommendations, the first recommendation about prioritizing the allocation of resources to get maximum benefit, and how they want to focus that in terms of, saving the most number of lives, how they do not use sort of the QALY or QALY idea of quality adjusted life years. They don't go there. They have a reason for that. And just what then that looks like, right? How they prioritize those things, what that means in terms of, the use use of random selection in certain cases where, say, there is some kind of tie, the clear rejection of first come, first serve, the prioritization of healthcare workers, basically, whether or not, think about this, whether or not really is that fair? That's what you really want to think about. Is that actually the fair? That's what they're aiming for. And it can look a lot different than what we're talking about with Daniels, but whether or not this is indeed the underlying